See it probably up on the screen sometime. Ensalem. Next week we have coffee or breakfast connections. I was going to say coffee and donuts going back in time. There might be some donuts there, and there will be coffee, but breakfast connections next week, so come on up for that one. Then New Year's Eve day, we will have a prayer time here, a guided prayer time for the upcoming year and other things like that. So I'm going. This is the last of our three times with Heroes of the Faith, and we're going to go back in history. So I'm going to turn to Dave, and he's going to do his thing. So
thank you. It's still a lot of noise up here, but Thank you. That's maybe not quite enough, but we'll figure it out eventually. So thank you, I want to thank Pastor Kyle for the opportunity to present today. We've had some outstanding presentations from Peter and Patty, and I can't hope to match them, so set the bar low. And actually, when Pastor Kyle asked me to do this, he asked me to present on a hero of the Bible, and I sort of turned my nose up and said, "Gee, I don't know if I can get there with a hero of the Bible." But I do have interest in heroes of the faith, and it goes a little bit to what why would we speak about a hero? And I think it's someone we can associate with, perhaps, and learn something from. And Anselm, who is not as big a name as some of the heroes of the Bible, perhaps, did make a substantial contribution on how we think about our faith. He lived between 1033, and I did the math wrong in my notes, so it was 1109, I think, which was quite a long age at that time. And for those of you who don't know my history, part of my work is as a director of graduate medical education. So I do this every day, unfortunately, unfortunately for my residents who have to sit and listen to me, but they have to sit here. You guys, you can get up and leave if you want. And so as part of that, there is a routine that we follow, and the first is to set out our objectives. So every presentation has an objective. The first objective today is that we can recognize that there is a history of ideas, not just a history of wars. That's a subtle jab to my historian friend here, because how do we think about history? We tend to conceptualize it in regard to the wars that happen, and that's easy because wars begin and they end and they have a significant effect on the social structures around them. But then so do ideas. I will hope that by the end of this you'll have an appreciation for the contributions which are made to the ways that we think about our faith. Concepts that we consider orthodox were kind of worked out after the resurrection. And what's our last here? To gain confidence in our faith through clear thinking and to gain efficacy in our sharing of our faith. So here we go. The first is an eye chart. I don't expect you to be able to read it. And actually, Elliot, who helped me put this together, and again quickly this morning by lending me his laptop, said, they're never going to be able to read this. Well, that's okay. This is a sort of an outline from Pentecost through the 2000s. The part of the history of Christianity that I'm going to consider really quickly is that from Pentecost through the Great Schism, or the formation of the Roman Catholicism. And basically the concept of this is that there was a whole lot going on. There were many, many things happening there, and I don't think we generally tend to think about. We're about to celebrate this wonderful miracle of Christmas. We don't think about what happened after that till where we are now. And so the other objective being to set up a context of why Anselm's contribution was important. And the early days of Christianity were not great. As we begin to think about the stories even in the Bible, we heard some weeks ago that there was an atmosphere of anticipation, and that was juxtaposed to the established status of the Jewish leaders, and then it was in Roman society which valued conformity and suppressed civil unrest. And so I feel like I'm having to ask permission from Peter a lot because he's like the historian here. And this is a very arbitrary breakup of types of persecution that happened in the early days of the Christian church. And the first phase, as I constructed it, was the Jews versus the Christians. And this we read about in Scripture. Jews were, the Pharisees were the keepers of the law. And it's said, I think, to think about this, that, Egypt built monuments, Greece built temples, and the Jews built schools. And they made a great effort to keep the fidelity of the sacred writings and to pass them on with consistency. And they had great respect for those who were entrusted with the words of faith. And so, Christ is seen as a threat. And that doesn't go well. The second phase, the Roman society. Rome practiced a policy of what's called syncretism. All religions, practices are okay, just so long as the emperor is venerated. So you got to keep the emperor on his pedestal, and then you can do whatever it is that you'd like to do. Unfortunately, that pits polytheism versus monotheism, many, many gods versus really only one. And the emperor was the high priest of polytheism. So things were not going well for those who insisted that monotheism was the way to be. And over time, like many societies, internal corruption within Rome and policy enforcement became increasingly rigid. And so the Christians, the Jews first, I think, and then the Christians were identified as the problem. So we're going to make Rome great again. We're going to kick out all the Christians. We're going to get rid of this thing. And unless you think that ancient history is really ancient, who's seen this bumper sticker lately? Yeah. So keep civil peace at all costs. All religions are co-equal. Nope. So, but then the church is within a society, and everything changes, maybe, with Constantine. So Constantine, the Roman emperor, converts to Christianity, maybe, depending on what you read. His alignment with the Christian church was for good or bad reasons. We heard in Peter's section about how the Roman soldiers used Christian symbols, and they won an unwinnable battle. And maybe there were some Christian soldiers in that group as well. So that it was sort of an expedient alignment between Constantine and the church, but it did slow down the troubles for Christians in the early days. And but still, in the back of his head, when I read what goes on, it seems to me that Constantine still had this impression of syncretism. Let's just all get along. Let's find a way to live together. But at the same time, the church was organized more as it grew, and it was organized along the same lines of the Roman court. So we had to have those who are in charge and those who aren't, and so the popes and the bishops were elected to be an authority, and that authority, I know I'm really going fast through all of this, but that authority was based on apostolic succession, which is a concept of you can trust us because we heard it from the apostles who heard it from Jesus himself. So that's why the words are trustful. But still, to his death, Constantine remained the high priest of polytheistic practices and paganism. So, good guy, bad guy? I don't know that we really even know, nor will we. And then, if that weren't enough, persecution phase 3, Christians versus Christians. So, Others interpreted various doctrines that weren't terribly well established at the time. And so there was a group of people called the Gnostics who said, in order to know God, you really have to have this really special knowledge. Not everybody can do this. Just special people can do this. Not unfit. There was Manichaeism. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And Augustine of Hippo, St. Augustine, was a Manichae before his eyes were opened and he became a Christian. Manichaeism celebrates good spirits that are good things that are spiritual and bad things that are material, and it just, yeah. And the third one that I have listed, Arianism, that's one of significant interest because it says, Jesus was a good man. He was a great teacher, but he wasn't really God. He was just, he was just a really, really great guy and had a divine mind. Well, unfortunately, that was very, very prominent and remains prominent, in some doctrines today. If you look at the websites for the Jehovah's Witnesses, for the Mormons, they recognize Christ, but he wasn't God. And orthodoxy was in debate. So what is right opinion? No one had established. Well, it hadn't been clearly established. So with Constantine at the helm, he said, but let's get to the bottom of this. And he begins to call councils, ecumenical councils at a place called Nicaea. And Nicaea, I guess it first started in 325. This is this western city in Turkey. And he called together all of the leaders of the time, the bishops, and they were to meet and settle a consensus on the divine nature of Christ. And the concept they were dealing with in their terms was homoousis, which is great if you play Scrabble because there's a lot of O's in there. You can use all of them. But it basically means same substance. So they were struggling over the concept that Christ was begotten from the same substance of God and therefore eternal and not created. And it took them 7 times of meeting together. And on one of those times, I'm going to try to bring this up to being relevant to today, they came together and said, okay, this is the Nicene Creed. This is what we're all going to say is orthodoxy. And if you grew up in the denominational churches, we sort of, those days they changed the designation to the Apostles' Creed, maybe borrowing on that same authority that we talked about. And these are things that the Father and the Son are of one substance. Christ was a man. He rose from the dead. There's one means of salvation. And that was supposed to settle it. Let's all agree on these things. Not like everybody was going to agree anyway, but that's where that came from. But enter the Goths, just when you thought everything was good. So you have the Osgoths taking over Rome, the Visigoths coming and taking over Spain, the Franks in France, the Vandals in North Africa, the Angles and the Saxon Britons. And the problem really was when Rome built all of those roads, and they were really good at roads, they didn't build any road signs. So if they'd have made them one way, we'd be okay. But they didn't. So they built the roads to spread the Roman culture out, and in come the barbarians. And boy, these were not great guys. And so that throws a monkey wrench into everything. And they were influenced by the Christians who were present at that time, but oftentimes they aligned with Arianism because it was a bit of a stretch for them to say, what do you mean this guy that we've never heard of in this place we've never heard of was really God, came to earth? So it was easier, I guess, for them to believe that that was the case. So we're almost there and this will not take very long. So the place then that Anselm was working within was feudalistic. There was perpetual wars between these different Gothic kingdoms. The church did lend some structure to a very chaotic society, and now the keepers of the scripture were monks, those who separated themselves, and they practiced various things, but monasticism, the formation of abbeys and monks within the abbeys, were an educational center, and they also practiced things like self-denial, asceticism, and as an expression of their faith. There was somewhat less trouble for Christians, but still, and they were missionaries to their surrounding communities. They were sort of the glue in many of these societies. But it's not quite over yet. So then, 616, Muhammad conquers Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Carthage, and actually was stopped coming through Spain in France at the Tour de Poitiers, I think, if my French is even close. And had they not been stopped, we'd probably be pointing east at this point to go to church. It's hard to even imagine. So now you have Islam taking the Holy Land, and then because there were popes and bishops, the Pope says, "Well, we have to take back the Holy Land," and I know I'm glossing a lot of things here, but unfortunately, he says we have to take back the Holy Land because God wills it, and he kind of crossed the line with doing that because I'm not sure he knew what God wills, and it didn't go well, so maybe that really wasn't the case. All in all, a very, very messy time. Not a lot of agreement. A lot of quasi-Christian concepts floating around amongst the people who are warring with each other. And enter Anselm. So he was born in 1033 to a very wealthy family. He didn't get along with his father, and so when his mother passed away, he left home. And he traveled to a place in southern France called Bec. I'm not sure it even exists anymore. And he traveled there on an educational mission. He wanted to learn from a monk that was there. He wasn't a monk at the time, but he wanted to learn from this fellow who was known as an educator. So he went and he joined this abbey, and shortly thereafter he did become a monk. He decided to take his vows of poverty and all the rest and begin his work there. And he wrote to assist the understanding of the difficult and contentious issues of the time. Later in his life, he did so well that he was put forward, however that happens, I don't really know, to become the Archbishop of Canterbury. I mean, this is a high post, and he really didn't want it. There's a significant writing that he has that says, I'd rather do anything else. I just don't want that responsibility. I don't want to be placed between the Pope and the King, and this is not my idea of a good time. His premise was that the creator of rational beings would leave a fingerprint in their mind leading back to him. And rational contemplation leads back to God, a Christian God, not just any God. And so his premise is that we should think about this. We should ponder this, as we heard last week. And while limited and vulnerable to deception, that grain of God-given rationality that we possess will reinforce the truth that we know by faith. We must know truth only by faith. But having established our belief, our contemplation serves to further clarify that truth to us. There's a line there. And the results. So he wrote a lot. This is what chiefs of abbeys did back in those days, is they wrote a lot of things, and the monks would copy a lot of things. This was before we had printing presses and any way of disseminating information outside of copying it and passing it around. And this is a sampling of what he wrote. His first real work was the Monologion. It was sort of a monologue. And the objective was to define and help us to know, how can we know God by his essence, by what he represents. Subsequently, he wrote his most famous writing, which is the Proslogion. And what led to the writing of the Proslogion was his desire to find one thought, one concept on which all others would depend. And that ended up to be what is known as the ontologic argument for the existence of God. And those of us who have grown and lived in the faith for most of our life feel like it's second nature. But there are actually four arguments for the existence of God. The ontologic argument is based on what his being is, and it is summarized in the phrase, that greater than which cannot be conceived. And that's one of those phrases that you have to contemplate for a while, because that differentiates the Christian God from other gods. And on that defense of God's character, he is able, through about 26, 27 essays within the Proslogion, to demonstrate God's omniscience, his omnipotence, his mercy, his eternal nature, and it's all there for us to think about. He also wrote Why God Became Man as a defense of the only effective means of redemption. And this in 10,050 some. Our God, given rational thinking, can align with the orthodox tenets of the Christian faith. I'm not going to go further into these works because they are the sorts of readings that when you read them, my habit is I read about 3 sentences and I stop, sleep on it, wake up, read them again. Maybe I can think of what that means. He was quite an impressive thinker, and I actually have a copy of a translation of those works if anyone's interested in actually looking at them. I think they're very reinforcing. And the result is that his works became a counterbalance to mysticism, taking people off in the direction of Gnosticism and unclear thinking. It was a counterbalance to the excesses of the kings and the popes of the time, and I think it acts as a consolation to us. He planted really the seeds that were harvested later and acted further on by the likes of Martin Luther and Menno Simons, founder of Mennonite Church, thinking about our faith in ways that help us to reinforce it further. So there we are. I hope that you can now recognize that there are ideas that flow through history in addition to wars, and sometimes there are wars, but wars come and go, and ideas tend to continue, and that there has been a significant contribution made to how we think about what we believe. The Nicene Creed, the thoughts that were presented in the Proslogion, and with contemplation of these, that we may gain confidence in our faith and clear thinking. We do not need to be challenged by sophisticated skeptics in our time. This is a solid faith that we have. And so those are my references. And since we have a minute, it is common for us to end this session with a prayer. So how about if I read Anselm's prayer? Because I think that sums it up nicely. I do not try, Lord, to attain your lofty heights, because my understanding is in no way equal to it. But I do desire to understand your truth a little, that truth that my heart believes and loves. I do not seek to understand that I may believe, but I believe so that I may understand. For I believe this also, that unless I believe, I shall not understand. Thank you.